I don't believe I've ever played a game quite like Hello Charlotte 3. There have been others that used odd storytelling techniques, and others still with complicated and introspective plots, but none that have sent me down quite the same rabbit hole as this one has. It's baffling to the point of becoming annoying and tries so hard to mess with your expectations and to convince you that the game itself is meaningless. But underneath all of that, it has a story that I can't help but feel fascinated by. It takes the world developed in the previous two games, cuts out the beating heart of those games, and then brings that world back to life by introducing you to new characters and developing old ones. It makes us care so much more about not just our protagonist, but about nearly every character with whom we come into contact with. At the same time, the story and message can often feel confused and uncertain, meandering through all sorts of side plots and deviations with very few proper explanations before the ending just throws a completely overwhelming amount of plot at you. But ultimately, I think that even in the midst of the horrors that it discusses, the game is a celebration of the power that stories can have, both for the creator and those who get to experience them, told through the story of what seems like a stranger whose life was profoundly changed by the art that he made. It really makes you work to just figure out what's even going on in the first place, but I think it's a journey that's well worth going on. Though I feel the need to clarify that this game is best understood if you've played it and its predecessors yourself. It's not necessary, and I will be filling the blanks as best I can for anyone who's not familiar, but things will get very complicated very quickly. Now, if you've played Hello Charlotte 2, then the beginning of the game is disorienting, to say the least, because it quickly becomes apparent that despite having the same name and appearance, this new version of Charlotte who you control is radically different from the person who we're used to. The Charlotte of Hello Charlotte 2 was deeply insecure and filled with suppressed feelings of self-loathing. She felt the need to be almost compulsively kind just to justify her existence to everyone around her. Whereas you quickly notice that this version of her is completely arrogant and does whatever will amuse her in the moment without any concern for the effects it'll have on other people. As well as that, in Hello Charlotte 2, Charlotte lived with an assortment of imaginary friends who were a constant source of comfort and support to her, to the point where she formed an unhealthy reliance on them, which trapped her in fantasy. Yet here, not only are these figures entirely real, but they hate this Charlotte so much that when they think she's died, they throw a party, which you very awkwardly walk in on. Then there's the school, which was originally a terrifying place of constant bullying and ostracization, where Charlotte suffered abuse and frequent panic attacks. Yet this time, well, it's the same as ever, but the new Charlotte is completely at home in this environment, and actively leads what is effectively a cult of popularity, who go around and execute any people who deviate from the accepted norms of the school, even in the most insignificant of ways. Charlotte's relationships too are distorted. Her friend Oneiri, who was once abusive and manipulative, is now the one being abused and manipulated. It's an almost complete inversion of the dynamics present in Hello Charlotte 2, as though a conscious decision has been made to make the beginning as shocking as it possibly could be. And apart from just being an arsehole, you realize that this version of Charlotte is unsettling to watch. From her creepy soulless eyes to her plastic smile, to how blatantly she breaks the fourth wall, implying that she knows far more than she's letting on. But more than that, she feels inhuman. Her detached reactions to everything make her so alien to the player. She's totally devoid of not just empathy, but of any understanding of how the people around her work. And her lack of normal responses to anything is both rather funny and very off-putting. She feels so separate from the world that she's in, that it's almost like she's just going through the motions in her sadistic way, and we're only seeing the surface of her personality while being unsure if there's anything underneath, or if she's just that hollow of a human being. Compare that to Hello Charlotte 2, which was fantastic at getting you into Charlotte's headspace and making you feel connected to her emotions and struggles. Hello Charlotte 3 actively cuts you off from any understanding of what's going on in Charlotte's head, entirely alienating you from your own main character, and leaving you totally confused. And this compounds with the uncanniness of the world around her. The game's locations have always been disconcerting, with most characters feeling cruel and hostile, and the world itself being apathetic and almost mocking of you. But in Hello Charlotte 2, this coldness was stifled by the array of extremely emotionally complex and sympathetic characters present, and the awfulness of the world only makes their humanity more apparent, and makes you care for them all the more. Here, you have no such luck, and no likable protagonist with which you can cling on to, or to empathize with. Everything about this world feels like it's trying to screw with your expectations, or to alienate you from the story. It very consciously takes away most aspects that made the previous game emotionally engaging, and replaces it with an intentionally uncanny and hollow-feeling world, seemingly out of malice towards the player. Everything clashes so much, the tone is bizarrely cheery, despite how awful everything is. I can't speak for most people, but for me, it creates this feeling of disengagement. after the initial confusion, you just settle down and observe, waiting for whatever is going to happen next. Even many of the most horrible things that happen are delivered with a sense of whimsy to them, like the first execution, in which Charlotte stars her victim in a so-called cooking show. She then explains with all the bubbly energy of a kids' TV show host how they're going to be baking cookies before force-feeding her victim cookie dough and burning her alive with a flamethrower. Describing it sounds horrible, and it is, but the way it's presented makes it hard to feel that. There's simply too much humor accompanying every horror, so you're left bewildered, but nonetheless entertained. Early game, there are two exceptions to how strained and soulless everything feels. The first is Scarlet Eiler, the class representative who seems actually concerned with the well-being of the other students, and the second is the aforementioned Oneiri Warhol. Though we don't get many scenes from her, Oneiri is shy and self-conscious, but also inexplicably loyal to Charlotte, buying her lunch and trying to be kind to her, despite Charlotte never reciprocating any of Oneiri's gestures. At the same time, she's clearly trapped in an abusive friend group, with 3 of her friends actively bullying her, and Charlotte sitting back and letting it happen. We can sympathize with Oneiri and the awful situation that she's in, and relatively early on, we get a window into Oneiri's backstory. She explains that she only has low self-esteem because her parents never seem to notice or care about her, instead only focusing on her brother, who's a shut-in, who refuses to interact with the outside world at all, slowly wasting away in his room, and deteriorating to the point where he's been overtaken by a monster. While it's entirely fair that Oneiri's parents will be worried, they've forgotten about Oneiri and leave her to fend for herself, unloved and stuck with toxic people who seek to use her. Oneiri explains all of this to Charlotte in the middle of a panic attack, crying and overwhelmed by emotion. Everything about the scene tries to move you and pull at your heartstrings. Everything except for Charlotte, that is, who is, as usual, completely uninterested, and does less than the bare minimum to help, not even pretending to care. Eventually, Charlotte leaves, and the very next day, Oneiri is put up for execution due to her unpopularity. The only real bond that the audience forms to the characters is totally stifled and eventually snuffed out by Charlotte. It's almost as if there is a story here, trying to break free, one with fully fleshed out and interesting characters, but that it's Charlotte who's repeatedly shutting it down by refusing to engage with anyone on more than a surface level. But as we'll see, her efforts are entirely in vain because there is meaning to this story, and the more Charlotte tries to take it away, the more meaning she gives to it. And to explain what I mean by that, I'll need you to bear with me for a little while, because as Charlotte makes her way home one day, Scarlet sneaks up behind her and injects Charlotte with a serum that allows both of them to see into the other's memory, allowing us to periodically view Scarlet's backstory. And what we see is another world, the real world, and in it is a boy named Charles Eiler. It becomes quickly apparent that Charles lives a life draped in falseness. He spends his time at school pretending to be normal and to be okay, and then goes to spend his free time with his fake girlfriend, Oneiri Warhol, while knowing that they're both only using each other to fit in at school. Oneiri particularly is obsessed with blending in with those around her, so that she never risks becoming an outcast and can never be bullied. Only Charles knows how rotten to the core her persona is. And then he goes home and logs into his computer, in order to write stories and escape into fantasy under his account named Charlotte Wiltshire. He does this despite thinking that his stories are rubbish and lacking confidence in his abilities. Finally, he makes dinner for his mum, Lilith, who is very ill both physically and mentally. And by this point, she is so divorced from reality and deep in delusions that she doesn't even realize Charles is there. Instead, when Charles speaks at her, she hears the voice of Scarlet Eiler. Lilith was forced by her husband to abort Scarlet in the womb, and the grief of doing this destroyed her, leading that same husband to abandon his family, leaving Charles effectively without parents, and leaving Lilith to continue deteriorating until eventually, as she slipped more and more into insanity, she began to believe that Scarlet really had been born, and entirely forgot that Charles even existed. Whenever she looks at Charles, all she can see is Scarlet. All his life, he's been held up to the idea of Scarlet Eiler, and since she never existed, Lilith builds her up as the perfect daughter, someone who never falters, never fails, someone who's dutiful, dignified, and diligent in every way. And how can Charles compare to that? He's not perfect. In many ways, he's an emotional wreck, and so for all of his life, the shadow of Scarlet Eiler loomed over him. On top of that, when his mum started getting sick, he vowed to become a doctor in order to find a cure. This became all that drove him to get up in the morning, just this faint hope of having his mother back again. And it's a false hope. There is no chance, even if he did become a doctor, that he could single-handedly invent a cure for what's affecting her. Again, his aspirations are just him lying to himself, but the pressure that he puts on himself and his inferiority complex to a person that never was began to manifest as his own idea of Scarlet, no longer as a person who's perfect, but as someone who expects perfection. He creates what is effectively a tulpa, a figure of his imagination, who has her own will independent of Charles. This imaginary version of her viciously berates him for not doing well in exams, and mocks him for every second that he isn't studying. To her, if he's enjoying himself in his hobbies, then he isn't saving Mother, and if he isn't saving Mother, then he's a worthless little maggot. And she's fake, obviously. She exists in his head, but he's so deep in that falseness that she becomes just as real as anyone else in his life. Once again, it shows how all his life he's trapped in falseness. His goals are based on him lying to himself, his relationships are built on false pretenses, his joys come from escaping reality, and his pain comes from comparison to a person who doesn't exist. However, he has one person with whom he feels truly connected to, a boy named Vincent Wordsworth, also known online as C. In him, Charles sees a genuine friend, someone who he admires and who he can talk about anything to, someone with whom he can really be himself. However, Vincent is far from a happy person, and during their correspondence he explains his belief that once somebody dies, their soul expands to become an entire world, totally shaped by who they were. It's because of this that he plans to commit suicide by jumping off a roof. Charles makes a pact to join him and almost goes through with it before pulling out at the last minute. But in those final moments, he actually sees Vincent as who he really is, a scared, lost teenager, no different from himself. And he realizes all this time, he didn't know Vincent Wordsworth. He only knew the idea of Vincent that he built up in his head. He had been romanticizing someone who he'd barely known, and placing this faulty image at the center of his world. In one day, he has not only lost the only person who he really understood, but he's realized that he never truly knew him in the first place. And once again, the closest thing he has to a friend is Oneiri, but his relationship with her is constantly marred by how she's still obsessed with using their interactions in order to strengthen her image at school as popular and well-adjusted. Charles can't tell if she really cares about him deep down, and they're both still using each other. This is until Oneiri has to move away. She's absolutely furious about being ripped away from all she's known, and tells Charles how sick of everything she is, and how much she'd love to just escape it all. Charles, who is still heavily influenced by Vincent, reads her want for a way out in a much darker way than she meant it. So he rents them a hotel room, and offers Oneiri a handful of pills for them both to overdose on. However, instead of the relief that he expected, she is horrified. That horror then turns to white-hot anger at the idea, before finally cooling into an understanding of how awful Charles's life has become. As she tries to comfort him, he tells her that he shouldn't have been born, that they'd all have been happier if Scarlet had been born instead. Oneiri retorts that she values him. She sees him, not the distorted version of him that others see, but the real him, all of him, and she accepts that person. She tells him that he deserves to live, and that she's glad he's here, not Scarlet, just him. She points out how much she loves his stories, the ultimate expression of his identity as an individual, the thing that he does to let all of his emotions out and to be himself. Those stories are something that she looks forward to. The whole scene is haunting, from the dialogue to the striking art that's shown, to the sheer mixture of rage and grief on Oneiri's face, and the exhaustion on Charles's. This version of Oneiri, the real Oneiri, does care. For years she's cared, and perhaps the cruelest thing is that Charles finds this out just before she leaves forever. They continue to talk online, but it's not the same. And in the vacuum, Scarlet exerts more and more influence on Charles. As we learn in Oneiri's diary, Scarlet takes full control of Charles at some points. Eventually, Charles and Oneiri stop talking altogether, and Charles is left with nothing but Scarlet. Nothing but that abuse and that poisonous pressure weighing him down constantly. And on the day of the trial, when Charles is to be tested in an unspecified way, he fails to live up to that expectation of himself, and he truly does commit suicide by drowning himself in a lake. If you think that came a bit out of nowhere, well then you know how it feels to play Hello Charlotte. Throughout the first half of the game, you occasionally get these flashbacks to Charles' life. At first they're completely nonsensical, but as you continue, you start to understand how Charlotte's existence came to be. When Charles died, his soul cube really did expand to become an entire world, just like Vincent theorized it would. And that is the world we see Charlotte in throughout the series. The world is programmed to endlessly churn out stories, the only thing that Charles was passionate about. We start to realize that all the characters of the house, Aidan, Bennett, Huxley, etc., are all manifestations of Charles' own stories. The people that Charles actually knew appear to manifest as fragments of his perception of them, with only a small amount of their personality showing, to suit the story that's being told. One such example of this is Oneiri. Real-life Oneiri is complicated. As we learn in her diary, her mother only had Oneiri to save her marriage, and her father never wanted her at all. So once that marriage crumbled and her birth mother left the house, her father remarried and had a new child named Henry, who sucked up all the attention and love in the house, leaving Oneiri neglected and alone. As they grow, her brother develops into a shut-in and is likely dealing with depression. And as much as he's struggling, and he deserves sympathy for that, Oneiri can't help but resent him for how his parents do everything for him and nothing for her, how she's meant to support his addictions financially by working, and how she's had to fight through her problems for so long while he refused to do absolutely anything to overcome his problems. So much of her identity has been forged by being her brother's shadow. She tries to resist it, like how she insists on being called Oneiri rather than her full name of Henrietta, likely because of how similar it is to Henry's, but it's impossible not to feel insecure when everyone around you acts like you don't exist, or like you're just some resource to be used and used for someone else's benefit. At school, she's the victim of vicious bullying, unaccepted anywhere she goes, and because of this, she develops a desperate need for the attention of her peers, and to protect herself from them however she can. She puts up a persona of someone who's living a perfect, popular life, without a care, and cakes herself in false smiles and interests, never being able to truly show herself to anybody, in case they abandon her or mock her. Everywhere she's forced to live for others' expectations. She needs to sustain her brother, or to please her classmates, because the second she can perform her role as purely self-sacrificial, they'll all turn on her and cannibalize her once again. This goes so far that at one point she bullied Charles for months, just to fit in with everyone around her and seem normal. Despite what she did to him, Charles was the first person with whom she was honest, and though their relationship was riddled with falseness, there were many moments where their genuine care for each other shone through. Yet, that doesn't erase the person she could be towards him. She did bully him, and she often puts her image over actually interacting with him. While nothing excuses the bullying, her obsession with her persona is understandable, yet it definitely seems to have affected how Charles viewed her, and those negative traits were distilled into the Oneiri that we see in Hellish Charlotte 2. All her kindness is removed, and in seeps her fakeness, and her desire for companionship develops into a toxic desperation, which leads her to isolate and bully Charlotte. But in Hellish Charlotte 3, we see another side to her, as someone who's scared and meek, who allows people to treat her horribly because she knows how much worse they'll be if she fights back. Neither of these are Oneiri, but they are pieces of Oneiri, plucked from Charles' mind and amplified to suit the needs of the story that she's in. And as for Charlotte, well, she's the protagonist, of course. And as the protagonist, she has one role to fulfill, making an interesting story. And when she's come to the end of that story, she is destroyed, before being replaced with a new Charlotte for a new story in an endless cycle. Though this world is based off of Charles' imagination, he actually has very little ability to affect the things in the world. Instead, he just quietly observes, interacting with Charlotte occasionally, but only having limited methods to affect the plot. He acts in the same way that we, the audience, do. But the Charlotte that we find in the third game, who is named Q84, is aware of all of this. She knows how the world she's in works, and she knows that everyone in this world is just fulfilling their programming. She knows about the audience, and about her ultimate fate of being destroyed once the story ends, and she knows that every time she dies, she'll only respawn shortly later. And most importantly, she knows that everybody else in this story lacks a proper consciousness, and is just acting according to how they've been programmed in Charles' head. They aren't aware of anything, and realizing that she can't avoid this fate, she instead decides to rebel against it in every way that she can. She understands her own powerlessness and the meaninglessness of this world that she's trapped in, so she grasps at whatever bits of control she can through mocking the player, while bullying and murdering the students. And she supplements her empty life by trying to amuse herself however she can. She knows that what the audience wants is a good story, and so she aims to block us from that story in any way she can, because to her, we are the reason she is suffering. If it were not for us, then she wouldn't be trapped in this limbo of a world. And when you consider all of this, Q84's actions are much more understandable, because she knows that nobody she speaks to is a real person, and that they don't have any actual feelings, so when it seems like they're suffering, all they're doing is carrying out their programming. As we find out later, early on in her life, she was bullied as ruthlessly as HC2 Charlotte, yet instead of simply taking it, she resists what are effectively robots in every way that she possibly can. As such, her cruel actions are simply an extreme reaction to her suffering, and ultimately, her victims aren't even alive to begin with. As well as that, her demeanor is a result of being stuck in this awful situation, and knowing she's merely a tool for you. Can you really blame her for growing so apathetic? In fact, we can see how she treats actual people in her interactions with Charles, with whom she seems to share a strange bond. After all, Charles is the only real thinking person who Q84 interacts with, and Q84 is the only person that Charles interacts with at all. As such, they find a weird comfort in each other. Compare Q84's reaction to Oneiri's panic attack, and her later reaction to Charles' panic attack. With Oneiri, she's psychopathically unsympathetic. But then with Charles, well, she's still kind of an arsehole, but she does stay with him, and does comfort him, albeit in a small way. She's not exactly kind, but she shows a level of care and humanity that's otherwise absent from her character. I believe that it's these honest interactions and the power that she holds over us which allows her to at least tolerate living in this state, because she does have the ability to make a single wish which will grant her anything that she desires, while ending the story and permanently killing her in the process. The fact that she doesn't implies that she prefers this life to actual death, but unfortunately for her, the mere fact that she's a good character with a sympathetic backstory and compelling motivations means that her plan fails entirely. Once we found this out about her, all of her efforts to stop us from caring are rendered moot, and so she loses all power over us. And as the story progresses, we see Scarlet, who in this universe is brought to life as a fully fledged person. Now that she has a sense of morality and empathy, she's deeply ashamed of the things that her prior self did to Charles. So, when a mysterious entity known as the Umbrella Man tricks her into thinking that he's Charles, she's eager to help him however she can. The Umbrella Man tells her to influence the audience itself. He says that if they know how pathetic the origin of this story is, then they'll lose interest. Once they've lost interest, then Q84 will have one less thing to be spiteful about and will hopefully stop destroying the storyline. That is why Scarlet shows us her memories, in order to make us leave. That's part of why she comes after and attacks Q84, to disrupt the story. But of course, that's not what happens, and Umbrella Man knows this. He made a contract with us in the previous game to help us see the story through to the end, and his true goal is to fulfill that contract by ensuring that everything continues smoothly along. And now that we know all of this, we are going to play through to the end just to see what happens. With this, the game's story begins to crystallize more and more. Henri's execution is interrupted by Scarlet, who's now hell-bent on redeeming herself and carrying out what she believes are Charles' wishes and saving everyone. At this point, Q84 rapidly begins to lose control, with the house inhabitants turning against her, and Scarlet tracking her down at school in order to show you the last bits of Charles' memories before killing her. And this strips Q84 of not just the power over us, but of the power over anyone or anything that she's been enjoying this entire time. In fact, being this petty god was really one of the only things that she enjoyed about this world. Without that, she has no interest in it. On top of that, she has been learning Charles' backstory alongside you, and she's disgusted by what the previous incarnation of Scarlet did to him. So, after being pushed into a corner and captured by Scarlet, Q84 is sick of this world and intent on revenge. She invokes that world-ending power in order to kill Scarlet and herself in the process by taking power back into her own hands one last time and giving a final fuck you to the player by cutting them away from their entertainment source. And as Q84 collapses onto the floor and her skin begins to rot away, Charles steps up from off stage. In a scene that's reminiscent of when Q84 sort of helped him through his panic attack, he takes Q84 in his arms, and while he doesn't exactly comfort her, he still provides support by just being there during her last moments. In a strange way, the only people they had were each other. Indirectly, Charles is the root of every issue in her life, and she holds at least some resentment towards him for that. But he's also the only person to show her true compassion or to guide her through this world in any way. And for Charles, he's seen goodness knows how many Charlottes, and this one is the first to truly understand her situation. So many of them were pre-programmed to react in specific, predictable ways. However, Q84 was aware of him and knew him more intimately than any others. So when he spoke to her, it was like speaking to a real person again. It's ironic, actually. Even as Q84 is talking about how meaningless her life has been, she can't help but be comforted by having someone to lean on. And the fact that they mattered so much to each other, and they were able to connect to each other and help each other, is meaningful, despite what Q84 insists. Even in a world with no inherent reason to care about anything, they both managed to make a purpose for themselves. And the sad thing is that now she's gone, Charles is once again stuck in this world of endlessly repeating stories. But even though this world has been destroyed by Q84's wish, there's a near infinite number of worlds just waiting to take its place. So we log into a new game and find ourselves playing as Scarlet Isler. It seems as though this isn't the Scarlet Isler we knew before, but rather a version of her who exists in this new world. She wakes up surrounded by corpses and is confronted by this world's Charlotte, codenamed V19. Like Q84 before her, V19 is fully aware of the nature of this universe. However, without Charles to guide her, she fell completely into despair, with the maddening loneliness and suffering she endured, leading her to massacre everyone else in the school, and leave only the inhabitants of the house alive. And though she could easily do the same to Scarlet, instead she simply leaves, inviting Scarlet to try and find her. A terrified Scarlet flees and ends up unknowingly hiding in Charlotte's house, being found by another house resident named Felix Honecker. He tends to Scarlet's wounds and shows her a parasite which he believes is the source of V19's powers. And somehow, there's something that pushes Scarlet to ask to have the parasite inserted into her own brain so that she can merge with it. She says that she wants this power to match V19 and to stop her, but something isn't right. She doesn't want to take a risk such as this, but something is forcing her to. Even if she's asking Felix to perform the operation, her mind is screaming at her to call it off. Even if she follows him to the surgery, her head is begging her legs to turn around. And even if she wants Felix to stop, she can't ask him anything other than to begin the operation. She knows how dangerous this is, and she knows that she likely won't survive, but she can't stop. And so, she and Felix, later joined by 2 other workers named Bennett and Florence, begin their search for where V19 may be. The world of the game is expressed in 11 floors, each of which containing their own mini-world, and using his technology, Felix detects Charlotte's presence in 4 out of these 11. From this, he theorizes that there are multiple Scarlets present in the world, and they travel to each of these floors hoping to find V19. Despite lacking Q84's antics, the character dynamics in the second half of this game still managed to be a lot of fun, and to be really interesting. Felix is well-meaning, kind at heart and curious, but he's also an overconfident, sulky smartass, which mixes really well with Scarlet's lack of confidence and her confusion, while both work with the childish and unhinged side of Bennett's personality to create some really entertaining dialogue. Florence too makes a good foil for Scarlet's normality, due to being more sane and restrained than Bennett, but still being unsettling in just how calm she is in situations where she really ought not to be. And the dialogue includes a lot of really funny moments, like when Felix gives Scarlet a plush bunny to try and cheer her up over her impending death. And about 80% of what comes out of Bennett's mouth is pure gold. The areas that you go through are quite dark in tone, and especially the developing side story about Florence and Bennett's background is rather harrowing to read about. So having the characters being so enjoyable to be around prevents you from getting worn out by how messed up everything can get. They provide nice breaks to the main storyline, and soften the sense of dread as you slowly ascend the floors. And I apologize for the tangent, but accompanying the main story beats of the section are a number of side stories, and I unfortunately can't discuss them all, but I wanted to briefly highlight one before getting back to the main story, because I feel like it gets somewhat forgotten behind the more recognizable characters, while being possibly the most interesting out of these 3 side stories. This story is the one told in the Word Village, where the personifications of languages are being slowly absorbed into one great mass, so that all the language users will have one singular language to speak. They accept this fate because they see it as a necessary sacrifice so that the speakers can better understand one another. It's fascinating, and feels to me like an analogue for how a select few languages have grown to become international methods of communication, and how that's a beautiful thing because it helps us connect with one another, but also a deeply sad thing, because that and many other factors are leading to the shriveling and to the death of so many other unique and ancient smaller languages. Though I would say that those smaller languages haven't been simply accepting their fate as is shown here. In many places there are enormous efforts to revitalize those older languages so that they can thrive alongside the new ones. But overall, I think that it's a very small and subtle part of the game, largely separate from the overall plot, but I really appreciate its inclusion. Getting back to the main story, as we ascend, a central theme seems to emerge, at least to me, that of self-sacrifice and forcible sacrifice. In each floor, the Charlotte you find has sacrificed herself or been sacrificed for the world she inhabits, and each one helps Scarlet and the player understand V19 just a bit more. In the first area, you find that Charlotte has given up her life to better enable the other worlds to communicate with each other through the single language, which is a deeply noble thing, but it still plants the question in our mind as to why she did this. We have no contact with this Charlotte herself, and we don't know what's motivated her, if it was of her own will, or if it was coerced in some way. Everything is vague, and we're not quite sure if we're getting the full story here. So we move on to the second area, where Charlotte has been found. And in this world, she was kidnapped by scientists, who twisted her into a monstrosity, as they hooked up her brain to a machine that turned her mental activity into mass-produced entertainment, to be sold to an unknown audience. She's alive, but it's not clear if she's conscious, or if she's been stuck into some kind of permanent coma. But we do know that every aspect of her being is being abused for the entertainment of others. It's the absolute worst form of sacrifice, being forced to give your life just for the selfish desires of others. And it's the most horrific scenario that we've seen yet. While the Charlotte before probably gave herself up willingly to accomplish something truly meaningful, this Charlotte is the complete opposite. And finally, we enter the third area before going into the last floor. We see that this entire floor has collapsed and become unlivable. So, to prevent everybody's death, this Charlotte has evidently used her wish in order to save everybody, at the cost of her own life. We can see from the smile on her face that this Charlotte is happy and content. She wanted to make the sacrifice, and she did so to save everybody, while understanding the consequences. And now, she's at peace with how everything has ended. But that doesn't feel like the full story. After all, it's been established that these worlds are programmed to make Charlotte endure horrific bullying and ostracization. And even though it's not confirmed that such things are happening on this specific floor, I think it's highly likely to have occurred. And if this is the case, then we're seeing the remnants of a person who was rejected by her world, but still felt the need to save it. As much as it's heroic, it's also brutally depressing that this person who's lost so much is being made to lose more. Even if this Charlotte is happy with her decision, she should never have been put into a position where she had to make it, especially because every Charlotte seems to have been put into this situation sooner or later. The problem isn't that she sacrificed herself. That was a selfless and kind thing that she had every right to do. The problem is that it seems like in each universe, the Charlottes are expected to make every kind of sacrifice. They have their happiness taken by a world that's actively against them, and they lose their mental stability for factors that they can't control. They're abused in service to a distant audience, and in so many cases, by force or by circumstance, they're made to sacrifice their entire beings for those exact people who've made their lives miserable. We've seen so much of this ourselves, playing Hello Charlotte 2, and seeing that world of Charlotte be used by those in the school for their own selfish interests, and in most endings being singled out as the scapegoat for everyone else to blame, and sent to die. Is it any wonder then that V19, who understood how sick this whole system was, went insane from the pressure of it all? While most Charlottes are forced to give themselves up, V19 rebelled against those unfair expectations. She killed nearly everybody, that is true, but again, she knows that none of them, aside from Scarlet, are even conscious of what is happening. When you consider all of that, far from a monster, she's a victim of a world where she's been taken advantage of countless times and left without anyone to support her. But we still haven't gotten her perspective, and since there's no sign of her on any other floor, that leaves only 11F, the floor from which it's said that you can never return. Whatever happens up there, this is the end of Scarlet's story. But why? Why is she doing all this? And well, Scarlet's motivations are difficult to discern in their entirety, and seem to stem from a number of different sources. Her reason to want to locate V19 appears to come primarily from whatever force is controlling her, and you can just view her other reasons as her mind scrambling to find a justification for why she ingested the parasite. But I think it's more than that. The most clearly stated reason is that she wanted to understand what drove V19 to this point, and stop her from hurting anybody again, which is a noble goal, but still, I don't think that's all, because at night, the parasite appears in her dreams, having taken a human form in her mind, and it seems to reveal many of the things that Scarlet doesn't want to admit about herself, especially because of how V19 suffered because of the bullies at her school, and how Scarlet, for all her moral uprightness, did nothing. She never liked V19, she was arrogant and insistent on being special, and above everyone else, so when she was subjected to all the worst kinds of bullying, Scarlet was happy to ignore it. And that makes her attitude quite interesting, because she's often upset by the fact that she's unable to help anyone during her travels through the floors, even though, when she had an opportunity to truly help and make a difference in someone's life, she didn't take it. Maybe she's not the person doing the bullying anymore, but she's seen the effect that it's had on Charles, so the fact that she was so callous towards V19 calls into question if she's really changed. The parasite brings up deeply ingrained guilt and insecurities, things which Scarlet couldn't admit to herself openly. So I think that she always knew that she was wrong to let V19 suffer, but she suppressed that guilt, only for it now to creep back to the surface as she realizes how much she wants to fix everything that she allowed to happen, but finds herself utterly unable to help or impact anything anymore. This is her last chance to do anything, her last chance to avenge the students and to make up for how she abandoned V19, and her last chance to forgive herself for what she did to Charles. She cannot afford to fail. The door opens, and Scarlet emerges into darkness. You hear V19's voice mocking you before she turns on the lights and reveals this monstrosity. Made from grotesque contortions of flesh with bulbous eyes erupting outwards, on its core are countless clones of Charlotte hanging lifelessly, like dead flies in a spider's web. Yet, despite its ferocious appearance, the monster wails in pain as though it is as horrified by itself as we are. This creature, as V19 tells us, is Charles' mother, Lilith. I spoke about how the people in this world are representative of what they meant to Charles during his life, and that's very apparent here. Charles dedicated so much of his existence to trying to save his mum. She was everything to him, and as a result, this version of her is the most powerful being in the world. But she's also someone who controlled his life, albeit unintentionally. She's powerful in Charles' mind, but she's also the victim of her psychological issues, and of the betrayal of her husband. She never meant to cause any problems, and she's suffering more than anyone here. We're told that this version of Mother exists essentially to churn out new Charlottes in order to create new stories filled with new conflicts and new pain, only then to reset and begin the cycle again, with the only purpose being to entertain the spectators, those spectators being, of course, us. Mother unconsciously drives the story by subconsciously twisting the characters' motivations to act in ways that are more compelling for the plot. That is what pushed Scarlet into ingesting the parasite, and that is what happens here. As Scarlet's personality traits are changed to make her filled with uncontrollable rage to the point of attacking V19, because after all, the conflict between Scarlet's desire to talk to V19 and her desire to murder her for what she's done makes for better drama to keep the audience engaged and entertained. And from there, V19 goes on a tirade about how the entire story, all 3 games, were just a part of a pointless cycle of consumption. The creator makes a product, the audience consumes it, they stick with it for a while, and then they move on to the next big thing. All the while, the creator needs to pump out more and more content in order to sustain themselves. The joy of making art turns into the drudgery of making a product, because if they stop making content, then the audience will just move on, and they will just fade away. She accuses us of essentially reveling in the suffering of the characters, so that we use a constant stream of relatable characters in order to feel emotions, and then toss them away once we're done with them. She talks about how she tried to meet the audience's expectations, how she performed as best she could. She took all the suffering, all the pain, and tried not to complain. She thought that if she did that, then eventually it would stop, because we wouldn't let this continue. We valued her after all. But she realized that we don't really care. We're happy to watch her revel in how gruesome and upsetting it is. Seeing so much suffering makes us feel things, so we can pretend to be empathetic, when really we're the root cause of the problem. And we refuse to stop engaging in media, because we're addicts who need our fix. There are 2 layers to what V19 says here. On the one hand, there's the fact that, in the game's universe, she is genuinely being abused, specifically to create a story for us to consume. And on this level, she's entirely correct. Like I said earlier, she had every reason to fight against this world of mindless robots who were programmed to make her suffer. She broke from the strain of her suffering and stopped caring how people viewed her, openly talking about how she was the only true person and the only one who mattered. She became unlikable to the audience while seeming arrogant and self-absorbed to Scarlet and the other house members, so they abandoned her. In fact, what V19 is saying about the audience even somewhat applies to Scarlet herself. After all, V19 refused to perform likability, and that is why Scarlet ignored all the bullying she went through. Her arrogance was just a coping mechanism to begin with, but the tiny infraction of seeming slightly full of herself resulted in total ostracization from anyone who might have helped. She didn't perform, and the world destroyed her. It drove her to the point of losing any hope, and eventually to death at Scarlet's hands. But at the same time, the Charlottes who did perform, and served their prescribed purpose until the very end, they died all the same. And that's the tragedy of the Charlottes. No matter what they do, their stories must come to an end sometime, and almost always, it ends in a grand sacrifice, performed by a person whose ego is so broken that they can't value themselves in any way other than how they benefit others. The more I think about V19, the less I can justify calling her a monster in any way. But what she's saying also functions as a criticism of how we engage in art in the first place, and I feel that her points are quite weak in this regard, because obviously people don't just use media to temporarily entertain themselves before tossing it away and moving along. We don't do it because we're sickos who love watching suffering, and implying that we do comes off a little bit insulting. Because media, especially media like this, can have deep effects on people. They can inspire them and encourage them to create works of their own, or comfort them when they're lonely and upset. Sure, there's media that's simply a corporate money grab, and there are many things that are vapid and pointless, but they're quickly forgotten about. And the media which truly resonates is remembered fondly forever by those it touched. And in fact, her argument will be dismantled later, and the fact that it's so weak makes it feel almost like a strawman argument, which nobody was actually making, and that exists exclusively to be torn down. However, I do feel that her point about creators feeling like they have to create until they're burnt out and exhausted is much more valid criticism. People can feel like they need to perform endlessly to deliver more of what their audience is demanding, and it can end up with them resenting the projects that once brought them joy. That applies to many people, even non-creators. What was once a passion for you turns into expectations and an endless stream of deadlines till you've ground the joy out of it. But I think that's something else that sticks out about this game. It doesn't perform, and in fact it repeatedly rebels against our expectations. So much of how Charlotte 1 and 2 were tied to the original Charlotte. Nearly every character revolved around her in some way. She was the core of the series, and everybody expected more of her character. So a plot that features someone who's nearly the polar opposite of her before then completely switching the story progression and protagonist halfway through, well, it throws every preconception out the window and builds something new on top of it. And under the assumption that people just want their expectations satisfied, this game should have been disliked or dismissed, but people love it. It's just as beloved by the fanbase as Hello Charlotte 2, perhaps more so. The original Charlotte may have been the character who many people flocked around, but it was truly the game, the story, and the way that its message was delivered that people loved, not just one singular character. It shows that the core of the game was never Charlotte to begin with. It was simply the heartfelt story and the message present. Scarlet, too, can't accept what V19 has said. She has free will. She will prove V19 wrong. She will be better. She won't hurt anyone, and she'll make up for the things she's done. She won't fall into despair. If she can have just one more chance, then she promises herself that she'll be a good person. At this point, Scarlet is dying, but she has also become the protagonist, giving her the ability to invoke Charlotte's special power, and so she uses that power to take control of one of Charlotte's vessels, wiping her memory and ending the story of Scarlet Isler, however beginning the story of this iteration of Charlotte Wiltshire, who would go on to be the Charlotte of Hello Charlotte 1 and Hello Charlotte 2, meaning that all the events we've witnessed so far have been a prequel to those two games. And I won't mince words about it, this feels bizarre and contrived, while in my opinion, failing as a twist. While it's incredibly surprising, and it does change the story on a fundamental level, at least to me, it's not impactful. I don't find it to affect my understanding of these characters in any way. Scarlet loses all her memories, and her personality is distorted to fit with being Charlotte. Therefore, they essentially remain two different people. And because of that, finding this out doesn't make us rethink the actions of Charlotte in the prior games, because she's still the same person as ever, and she remains her own person. And as for Scarlet's plans for this to be her atonement, I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. Because by making this wish, Scarlet has ceased to be the person she was. It's not her who's being thrown into this world of pain. And sure, Scarlet will have to go through these trials as Charlotte, and will have to suffer. But I would argue, isn't it unfair to be putting the pressure of atonement onto a version of yourself who didn't do, and wouldn't do the thing you feel guilty for? Why is Charlotte having that put on her shoulders, when Scarlet already had the chance and never bothered to atone in the years that she was V19's classmate? This twist just doesn't have an effect, at least not on me, and the only reaction I had to this was mild confusion and then apathy. While it does certainly impact the other characters, we can't really share in that reaction, and the whole thing comes off as seeming kind of meaningless, at least to me. And I'm really sorry to have ended that section on a downer note, but we have now built ourselves up to enter the final act. The true ending of the entire series, what it's been leading up to this entire time. And before I go into this, I'd like to appeal to you, the viewer. Hi there. If you haven't played the game already, but you think that it's something you'd be interested in, then I think that it might be in your best interest to go and play it through. Because I view this ending as more of an experience than anything. I feel like me explaining my interpretation will take away your ability to experience the ending in your own way. Hello Charlotte, the entire series, is very flawed in many ways. One way being how overly complicated and difficult it is to understand. The ending especially is overwhelming, both the amount of information you're expected to absorb and hard to grasp due to how open-ended it all is. It can feel like this game is on a mad rush to just clarify all the loose ends and story threads hanging all around everywhere. And upon a first playthrough, you likely won't understand what's going on or how everything ties together, and that can totally be a negative. But through the haze of confusion, I and many others felt a very pure emotional reaction. There was a connection to these characters, forged not from quite understanding what was going on, but from empathizing with them regardless. I can't promise that you'll have that same response. You might even hate it, and I couldn't blame you for that, but I feel like it's something you should do on your own before my interpretation tethers you down and distracts you from how you uniquely feel. And I know that trying to pass off garbled storytelling techniques is actually good can come off as the height of pretentiousness, but I think there's real value here, just as long as it makes you feel something deeply enough. And I apologize for holding it up so long, but there's one more thing to clarify, and I didn't know quite where else to put this. In an afterword, the game's creator has said that this story is something deeply personal for her, and while I have no right or intention to analyze that aspect of the game, I bring it up because it infuses some of these scenes with a meaning that is really none of our business to speculate on. Even some of the scenes that I have criticized, and ones which I will criticize from my perspective as a player, and I want to say that it renders those criticisms entirely moot, because whether those scenes are technically effective storytelling for the player matters far less than what they mean to the creator. I'm leaving those criticisms in because they do affect the player's experience of the game, but I wanted to clarify that I don't think they necessarily should have been done in a different way. Now, let's continue. We once again meet Charles, in a mental recreation of his room, just after what would have been the end of Melancholic 2, as he completes the process of reviving Q84 into a new vessel. He brings her back, frankly, because he isn't sure that he can do what he's about to do alone, and Q84 is the closest person that he has to a friend here. But she's horrified to be brought back. She's lost everything, and the thought of having to live one more second in this world disgusts her. Any composure or control that she had is gone, and through her anger at Charles and her desperation to die, we see her humanity on full display. This is even shown through her character portraits, as the creepy possessed doll look is replaced by the real, deeply held emotions that she goes through. Charles asks her to come with him to watch the end of everything. As angry as she is, she eventually accepts and follows him to a television, broadcasting a recording of the confrontation between Scarlet and Me-19. This television set contains the soul of Charlotte, and it is the physical manifestation of all that she is and all that she was. Charles then explained that he watched this Charlotte for years, still cautious of her, because to him, this was the same Scarlet who abused him. But eventually, he decided to use a vessel to communicate with her, and test what kind of person she really was when push came to shove. To do this, she took the form of C, otherwise known as Vincent. And throughout Melancholic 2, C had been a source of constant support and understanding for Charlotte, someone who knew what she was going through. But this means that every single time that we've seen C in Melancholic 2, it hasn't really been C. It's been Charles taking on that persona. This discovery recontextualizes so much of Melancholic 2, making you rethink the entire character of C. And I have such mixed feelings about this. On one hand, it not just ruins, but erases his characterization. C, as the one person in HC2 who was honest with Charlotte, ceases to exist, and is replaced with Charles, who has been existing under false pretenses this entire time. Not exactly lying to Charlotte, but still acting disingenuously, so as to test how she'll react to what he does. In that way, he's using her, no different from everyone else. It leaves a bitter taste in my mouth, because C was a character who I really liked, and his friendship with Charlotte was something which I found very compelling, as well as that it's just deeply uncomfortable, and makes Charles seem almost cruel and creepy, like he has been toying with this vulnerable child, testing her endlessly because of the person that she technically used to be, even if that person is a total stranger to her. In some endings, he even inadvertently leads her to her own death. But on another level, Charles really was the scared child who we saw in Vincent during Melancholic 2. It feels as though his actions are not so much a cynical attempt to punish Scarlet, but more so an attempt to understand this Charlotte, and most of all, to understand his old friend Vincent. I have not mentioned him much, because his presence in the game is understated, but it can't be denied that he had a huge impact on Charles' life, and Charles always still thought of him as an enigma who he could never understand. And so this feels like an effort to put himself in Vincent's shoes, to understand how acting in that way must have felt for him, however invasive these methods are. And we know that for a long time, Charles felt a certain amount of responsibility for Vincent's death, as though he could have fixed Vincent and saved him, and that Vincent's death was a failing on Charles' part, and he tried to save each version of Vincent that was created in the story, only to fail time and time again, because no matter what he did, they were fated to die. I feel as though Charles taking on Vincent's form and mannerisms were a last, desperate attempt to keep him alive, but that too failed, and it failed because subconsciously, Charles always knew that he couldn't save Vincent, that Vincent's actions were his own, and that Charles couldn't have been expected to stop him. He'd known that in a way, but he'd never been able to truly accept it. However, his mental world shows him that it's not his fault, by creating Vincents that were doomed to die. And as much as it's a roundabout way to tell him, this really does make Charles understand and let go of his guilt. Just after the scene, we watch Charles saying one final goodbye to Vincent, because now he can accept that Vincent is truly gone. He uses what is essentially art as his medium, and through that he's able to let go of that memory of Vincent, which has been hanging over him for so long. I still don't like this twist, but I understand why it was done. This ultimately isn't C's story, or Charlotte's, it's Charles's. And ultimately this feels like Charles' last attempt to leave behind everything that was haunting him, so that he could start anew. And I think that theme of just having the ability to leave the past in the past and to see a future in yourself is a theme that permeates through this ending. Charles lets go of Vincent, but he also lets go of Scarlet by allowing Q84 to take a hammer to the TV set that contains Charlotte's soul and to smash it to pieces. This may seem bizarre at first. Charles has been on an entire journey to understand Scarlet and Charlotte, so killing her by destroying her soul seems needlessly cruel and unwarranted. But I have my own understanding of this. To me, it doesn't feel like it's been done out of malice against Charlotte herself. Her story was already over. It has said everything that it meant to say. To keep her artificially alive and frozen in her current state would be cruel to her. She wouldn't be living, she'd just be trapped there for all time. It would be a terrible fate for her. And I believe, after thinking it over, to make a regular sequel with this Charlotte as the protagonist would be dragging out a story that is concluded already, and has been done so in a satisfying way. There's no need for it, and I don't think anyone would have wanted for it to be extended in a way that feels unnatural. That's part of the reason why this story has expanded in scope so dramatically, and told a story nearly all its own, and has gained its own identity separate from Hellish Charlotte 2, even while remaining intimately linked with it. It may seem that having Q84, the representative of HC3, killing the original Charlotte, is an act of spite against it, or it's like HC3 trying to assert itself against the other games, but I don't see it that way. I see it more as a passing of the torch, from a finished game to one that still has a few more things to say before it itself is brought to a close. Therefore, bashing the Soul Cube, it only frees Charlotte from the limbo which her finished story was trapped in, and lets Charles leave the past in the past, letting him overcome the harm that Scarlet has done to him, so that he can move forward towards a better future. It enables a new story to dawn. And speaking of endings, Charles and Q84 enter Mother's chamber, where she's still clearly in pain, and Charles assures her that he'll take care of her, just like how he always promised. He brings out a syringe filled with one of Felix's concoctions and injects it into Mother, telling her that it'll be okay, she can rest now. As the liquid floods into her veins, it starts to kill not only her, but the house as well. The whole world of the story crumbles, and all the Charlottes who are soon to be made into protagonists wither away into nothing. Mother will no longer unwillingly dominate this world, and she will no longer suffer. Charles, once again, can move past that stage in his life. Charles always had difficulty in being understood for who he was in the real world, and understanding himself. He could never express the true Charles Eiler, only some paper-thin approximation of himself, tailor-made to suit the expectations of those around him. Falseness dominated everything. As we've discussed earlier, everyone in Charles's life considered him to be something different from what he was. Even his own mother couldn't recognize him, and due to Scarlet's abuse against him, he ended up with a distorted negative perception of himself. In all his life, he could only express who he really was through his stories. Far from V19's cynical take on art just being something meaningless, Charles created his art to scream out to the world that he was a person, that he had his own ideas and passions that he wanted to get out into the world. He was driven by the pure will to create, no matter whether or not anyone was watching, or whether or not his work was even good. He still did it purely because he loved to write, and in its own way, that makes his work beautiful. Through what he wrote, he was able to grow close with Oneiri, and despite that layer of falseness covering their relationship, she still saw who he really was in every work that he made. And again, it is his art that allows him to process the horrors that he's been through. It helps him overcome Vincent's loss, to understand Scarlet, and to put Lilith to rest. He may have twisted the people in his mind to become what they meant to him, rather than who they were, but despite those distortions, truth shone through, and he was able to see people for the real them underneath his perceptions of them. And as he says to you, getting all this out, it's helped him let go of his regrets. He's dwelt on them for too long after all, though he was able to build up something beautiful out of his experiences, and he was able to help others through telling his story. It's time for him to move on. The house collapses because, as much as it allowed him to figure things out, a place built of bad memories never was the healthiest place to make a world from to begin with. In the end, when the sheer weight of everything drives him to have a panic attack, it's Q84, his creation, which comforts him. She's there, even when everyone else is gone, to remind him that the end of one world is simply the beginning of another. It's okay, your world met its end a long time ago, but a new one will surely begin from scratch. The humanity you knew ceased to exist, only to make room for a new generation. A new day will come, and your time will start moving again. There's nothing to be sad about. Everybody defines art differently, but in my opinion, art is anything, whether it's technically good or bad, that was made with passion and a will to put yourself out there and create something. From the greatest literary works which served as the culmination of a person's mastery over language and emotion, to the terrible stories they wrote as a kid which, as embarrassing as they are for that person now, still began their love of creating. And to me, the story of Hellish Charlotte 3 is about someone who felt lost in life, using their art to find a place and an identity in the world. And therefore, this entire game is simply a reminder that art can have meaning. I know that I have made the same point in the previous video, and I'm sorry for sounding like a broken record, but I feel like it's so much more fully realized now, and so much more necessary to talk about. Art can connect us in ways that otherwise would have been impossible. Sorry for sounding a bit flowery here, but I think art is the gateway into the worlds that other people see, separate from your view of the world, and equally as beautiful as they can be terrifying. These worlds can widen our horizons, fill us with every emotion, and teach us about the feelings and perspectives of others. They can make us feel heard when it seems like nobody is listening, and can comfort us by showing that other people are there and that they understand what you're going through. Art is so much of the reason why we're alive in the first place. It drives us to keep on going, watching the imaginations of others bring so much joy into our lives, and it reminds us that the art which we create can help us understand ourselves better by exploring and interrogating our mind. We can unravel the complicated and mixed up feelings we have about ourselves and about everything around us. And most importantly, the things that you make can be truly meaningful to others. Your art can affect their lives in the most profound ways and genuinely help them. I've seen enough reviews of this game to know that it has left a deep mark on many people, myself included. But not just this game, any art that's been made from the heart. Just through talking about your own experiences through your art, you can make people's lives brighter. And it will inspire people to create more art in the future. Hello Charlotte will never reach a wide audience. It's too abstract and weird for most people to enjoy, which is understandable, I want to make that clear. It's nobody's fault, but it's also the kind of media which will stick with the people who enjoyed it, and I have no doubt that it will spur on those people to create works of their own and make others feel the exact way they did. This ending, and this game, is messy and ugly in many ways. It's nearly incomprehensible on a first reading. It feels divorced from large sections of the plot, like V19 and the other Charlotte stories are completely separate from it, and its attempts to explain everything at the last moment are clumsy and feel slapped at. There is so much that's thrown of you, so little of it makes sense, and the constant revelations risk numbing the player to the story entirely. But well, it's so hard to get across all these conflicting feelings that are always crashing around inside our minds. And this game, like Hello Charlotte 2, feels like a furious venting of all the frustrations and pain out into the world. There was no way that such a thing could be clean or perfectly put together. In a way, there's even comfort in knowing that a work with this many issues can ignite your passion in such a way. The fact that something with this many problems can be so beautiful and profound makes me feel like I don't need to worry about every little issue in my own work. And while I dislike how bluntly V19 tells you her message of art being rubbish, I think that this message is one that's been shown to you throughout, and has only been spelled out for you just now. It's been shown to you through how Charles found inspiration to create through reading Vincent's work, and how those creations have helped both him and us every time that the story has impacted you. It's been proving its own point. But as well as that, Q84 fought against her story meaning anything at all, and that was how she found strength and confidence. But that wasn't right for her. In the end, she chose to bring comfort to her creator when he needed it most and had nobody else. Unlike the other Charlottes, this act of sacrificing her last moments for somebody else, it wasn't forced, it wasn't demanded, it wasn't even expected. It was something she chose for herself out of compassion. And in doing so, she broke the cycle of Charlottes being used for other people's needs. This Charlotte was the one that Charles truly connected with. And from that connection, from creator to creation, was formed a genuine support and care, expressed not through a grand sacrifice, but simply through a few words of kindness, which can be all that somebody needs. It was simply a visible expression of what art can do for its creators. It's only through a creator forming a genuine connection with their creation, rather than an artificial bond, that a meaningful story can be told. The Charlottes we found throughout the world had their fates nearly predestined, and guided by a cold, unloving hand. But it was because Charles, the creator, showed so much compassion for, and interest in Q84, that she was able to make the decision to support him, all on her own. Hello Charlotte 3 feels like an experience that totally ignores any kind of norm in its form of storytelling, and its presentation, and in its message. It breaks away from what we had previously grown accustomed to, in a way that sometimes enhances the narrative, but which seems to me like it was done primarily due to a disinterest in following any preset rules for how a story should be told. Apologies for the speculation, but this game feels very unrestrained by expectations, as if it went off in exactly the direction that was wanted by the creator. It contains a great deal of commentary about how media can feel soulless, pointless, and meaningless, which it delivers with varying degrees of nuance. But one of the main things that it pinpoints as the problem are expectations of art. Expectations from their audience and from the creators themselves, which can weigh them down and make them tell a particular kind of story. And I can't help but look at a game like this, which is so unapologetically bizarre, and think that it overcame that expectation. The other Charlottes which Scarlet found on the floors of the house all imitated Hello Charlotte 2, in the fact that a benevolent Charlotte was eventually required to give herself up for the benefit of others. They, and especially the Charlotte you find in the second area, feel like what this game could have been without the full passion of the creator. Something which rehashes the same story beats, never trying to build a full and unique identity of their own. Not that these wouldn't have been able to tell compelling stories, but that they likely wouldn't have been as important and likely wouldn't have impacted the audiences in quite the same way. Their sacrifices were expected by the plot after all. And these final moments convinced me more than anything that both Q84 and Charles have found closure. Q84 found a purpose and realized that her life always carried importance, and Charles was able to move on after a story which expressed everything that he'd been through, so that he could create new and wonderful worlds. And at the very, very end, after every other message, we're greeted one last time by Charlotte, the Charlotte we got to know so long ago, telling us that everything worked out in the end, and that she has to leave now, but she hopes to meet us once again one day. And it doesn't make sense initially. After all, Charlotte ceased to exist when Q84 destroyed her soul, so how can she be here now saying that everything is okay? Well, to state the obvious, Charlotte never existed. She and everybody that we've met only survived through how they've impacted us. Her story is over, but it's still with us. And if that story meant anything to you, then it means that everything is okay in the end. Because, as I've said before, understanding and empathy are the greatest things that art can give its audience, and that's what matters in the end. That story will remain in people's minds, and every work which will be enabled by this series. Hello Charlotte is over, and there's nothing to be sad about.